Praise the Lord, my dear friends. We are on the third Sunday in Easter. And today in the Gospel, taken from the Gospel according to St. Luke, we see how two disciples of Jesus encountered Jesus when they were on their way to Emmaus, and how they recognized him while Jesus broke the bread for them. We can learn a few things from this passage. Before Jesus came and began to interact with them, they were already discussing about all these things that happened a few days before. How Jesus was arrested, scourged and crucified and so on. And they even mentioned that they had the hope that Jesus would be the one who would save them from the Romans. They were discussing about Jesus before Jesus entered into that conversation. And they were very sad about the whole thing that happened. But after they started to discuss with Jesus, their hearts started burning, which they mentioned later after realizing that it was Jesus. You see the difference? When they were discussing about Jesus, they still remained in that sadness. But when they started to discuss with Jesus, things began to change. That's exactly what happens in our life too. We may discuss about Jesus. We know a lot about Jesus. We may hear about Jesus from other people, but it may not make a difference in our life. We may still remain in the sadness, in depression, and so on. But when we begin to discuss things with Jesus, probably in our prayer, things will change. When discussion with Jesus or experience of Jesus as the Lord becomes part of our personal life, things will begin to change. We may know a lot of things about Jesus, but do we know Jesus personally? That makes a difference. In the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 1, verse 43 onwards, we see how Nathanael came to meet Jesus. Before he came to meet Jesus, Philip went and told Nathanael about Jesus. And Nathanael said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" He was discussing about Jesus with Philip. And he didn't have much faith in Jesus at that time. But when he actually came to meet Jesus and started to discuss with Jesus, his life changed. He thought of staying over with Jesus. And that made him a disciple of Christ. See, when he was discussing about Jesus, his faith was shallow. But when he began to discuss with Jesus, his faith became strong. He became a disciple of Christ. Same pattern we see in several occasions in the Bible. Today in the first reading, taken from the Acts of the Apostles, we see St. Peter courageously preaching about Christ. But look at Peter. In Luke chapter 22, we have the incident of Peter denying Christ 3 times. Look at that moment when he was denying Christ. He was just speaking about Jesus, or people were trying to talk to him about Jesus. And he kept saying, "I do not know him." But later, when the cock crowed, he remembered what Jesus had spoken to him, or how he had spoken to him. He recalled his personal experience of listening to Jesus, not about what people talked about Jesus. That made him change his heart. And he moved away from that people who were talking about Jesus and cried bitterly. And later we see, after the resurrection from the Gospel according to St. John, Peter was sitting near Jesus, and then Jesus asked him, "Peter, do you love me?" He said, "Yes, Lord, I love you." A second time again, "Peter, do you love me more than all these?" He said, "Yes, I love you." And again a third time Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" Peter was even upset why Jesus asked him a third time. Why? Because he was not talking about Jesus, he was talking with Jesus. When we develop that habit of talking with Jesus daily, when we make sure that we make effort to enter into that personal relationship with Christ, things will begin to change in our life. And look at these 2 disciples who were going to Emmaus. They knew that in their group, women had gone early in the morning and had an experience of Jesus who had risen from the dead. They had heard about it. Probably they discussed about it. But it didn't make much impact in their life except that knowledge was in their mind. Their life was not affected by that. So hearing testimonies of others, etc., may help us in some way by getting us some knowledge about what Christ can do, but having a personal experience only will make a difference in our life. Even those women who went to meet Jesus in the morning, on the way they were discussing about all these things and worried also who will move the stone for them and so on. And when they saw that the tomb was empty, they were disappointed. And Mary Magdalene, who was sitting there, was disappointed and wanted to know where the body of Christ was. But when Jesus called her Mary, she understood it is Christ. And then she responded, Rabbi. She started to speak to Jesus. She started speaking with Jesus. That made her an apostle to the apostles. When she started speaking to Christ, she became the messenger of the good news to the apostles themselves. But these apostles, when they heard the testimony of Mary, even some of them went and saw the tomb, and these two disciples who met Jesus on their way to Emmaus came back and narrated the story to the disciples. They were not willing to believe. Mark chapter 16, we have that. They were not ready to believe. Why? Because they heard about Jesus, though wonderful things they heard, but they were not ready to believe. But when Jesus appeared to them, and that experience of Jesus became personal to them, they believed. That doesn't mean that we need to look for miracles only after that we can believe. Because Jesus said, you believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who believe even without seeing. So it doesn't mean that we need to look for miracles. But this means miracles do happen. Personal experience of Christ does happen only when we begin to make effort and try to have a conversation with Jesus and not about Jesus. We need to make effort and try to interact, talk with Jesus daily, face to face as a friend. The same Peter who denied Jesus for 3 times tells us today in the second reading, in him now you have faith in God who raised him from the dead. Look at the confidence that Peter have now. It's not because he heard about Jesus, but he began to speak, communicate with Jesus on a daily basis. So, my dear friends, in our life too, let us not just be satisfied by hearing about Jesus. Let's make effort and begin to speak to Jesus in daily conversation, in daily prayer. Let's make it our habit, probably to rise a little early, to spend a little time surrendering the whole day before the Lord, trying to communicate with our loving God. Because Wisdom chapter 16 verse 27 says, for what was not destroyed by fire was melted when simply warmed by the fleeting ray of the sun. To make it known that one must rise before the sun to give you thanks and must pray to you at the dawning of the light. So early morning prayer is very powerful if we want our weaknesses, struggles, problems, etc. to just melt away when we are exposed to the morning sun, that is Christ himself. And at the same time, Psalm 63 verse 6 says, on my bed I think about you. That shows how when we go to bed in the evening, we need to think about the Lord. Probably when we are on the bed just before sleeping, we can spend a few minutes thanking and praising the Lord for all the blessings that we have received on that particular day. In this way, when we make sure that we try to communicate with the Lord both in the morning and in the night, and of course throughout the day as far as possible, we begin to not just talk about Jesus, but we will begin to talk with Jesus. The love of Christ will become a personal life experience for us. May God bless each one of us.